can get some people up in the stream. But, oh boy. So how's quarantine treating you, gentlemen?
For me, I would say about the same as always. I mean, ever since the kid was born, that's all I do. I stay home. The only difference is I don't get to go to the comic book store on Wednesdays.
Well, that might change soon.
Yeah, well, I mean, our store did open back up, but only one person per household is allowed in there.
Yeah, we our stores we begin. I think our phase 1 begins tomorrow, or actually technically May 14th, but we're slowly opening up now. So it's we're
just to kind of get people trickling back in.
Yeah.
That's interesting. Because I'm pretty sure for me, we'll get like the rollout plan on May 20th, which leads me to believe that hopefully we'll start the first rollouts sometime in June. I know one of the big things that was like mandated by the CDC was that you have to show like 14 days of consistent decrease in hospitalizations before you can even begin your rollout. So I don't know. It's interesting because obviously like the southwest end of Connecticut borders New York, and that's like our densest population of like coronavirus infectees. So I'm interested to see how that's going to impact like the overall trajectory of Connecticut opening up. So
yeah,
it's definitely going to be interesting these next few weeks to see how it goes, because I know like as far as I talk to like most people and stuff, I know like especially here on the military base, we're basically in Charlie, which is like sort of like the super lockdown mode in a way until June 1st. But most of Anchorage is like I said, they're opening up with just, stuff in place. Like a lot of the private owned businesses, it's like the comic book store or other bookstores and stuff like that is like, if you come in, one person per household in at a time, you have to wear a face mask, all that fun stuff. And I mean, restaurants, you can start eating at restaurants again, but you can only do it through reservation. And then you have to give them your name, your address, your phone number before you're allowed to eat there.
Oh wow, that's insane. Yeah. I mean, I guess it's better to be safe than sorry.
Yeah, well, because like all the waiters and waitresses, they're like been totally cleared of COVID. So obviously, if a couple patrons come in and then one of them ends up with COVID, it's like, okay, well, let's log it for the day and probably try to see who it was.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I guess it's a pretty good roll call. I'm interested because I was talking to and Boom knows my buddy Edwin about what they're going to do with New York Comic Con, because I think it's like a 50-50 that it's canceled. And also there's like, obviously the there's the potential that like we're looking pretty good come October, but there's also going to be like a certain level of paranoia about traveling and concerns and whatnot. So I wonder like how that's going to affect them, and if they're still even going to try to sell tickets and then maybe see what happens from there. I don't know. I'm really, really curious. Because I mean, like it's what, October is 5 months away, almost exactly 5 months away for that con. So I can't I want to say that they're going to cancel it because it's in the epicenter of the United States for the virus. So
yeah.
I can't see it. I can pretty much guarantee you that even if I can't see myself I can't see myself coming to New York this year because of it. Regardless, it's no way in 5 months it'll be good enough. My family would kill me. They wouldn't let me go even if I wanted to.
Yeah,
it's just. I say that already. I already know that I'm not going to be going. I want to go, but I just don't see it happening.
Yeah, no, I don't. Sadly. I don't blame you, man. Like, your family's your priority. And there's always years after where it'll probably be back in a fuller force. You know what I mean? So I'm not, like I said, I'd like it to be in a safe scenario. But like ultimately, if we're not seeing some major drops, especially in New York City by then, I mean, I'd probably avoid going to it as well, and I can't imagine that creators will be all that keen about attending. So,
oh yeah, absolutely. I mean, just our local comic book convention that was actually supposed to happen last weekend. It got pushed to October too, and some are even speculating if that could even get pushed back even further or just canceled for the year altogether. Because as far as Anchorage goes, we're relatively low numbered because we're already isolated from the rest of the United States anyway. I think as far as it goes, last I checked, we're under 100 deaths. It's not very many. In cases as well, like we're still like way under there. Like I'd have to check again to see what it is, but I know we're like pretty low altogether, and that's like the entire state.
Yeah, I mean the numbers show, and it also makes me wonder too, because New York Comic Con is so big. I wonder if they might consider pushing it back instead of canceling. Because it is a huge event. Like maybe they could make it work sometime in like March. When there aren't really many conventions. I don't know. It's the only time will tell. But yeah, I think it'll be good for us to get rolling, get started, and I'll intro us in. Show. All right. Hey guys, welcome to the 38th episode of Let's Talk Comics, where myself and another co-host in the comic book community discuss one of the many facets of the storytelling medium that is comics. Whether it be stories, creators, constructs, or adaptations, we hit it all. This week, I am joined by two of my oldest collaborators. Of course, to my immediate descent here is my pal, Joe from Joe's Geek Show, joining us from Alaska. Brother, what's going on?
Not too much. Just, happy to be here as always. Looking forward to talking some nice comics with, my two buddies up here at the top.
Absolutely. And of course, we have my most frequent collaborator, the Canadian Cape Crusader, over to yonder, my pal. Jeez, man, English is not my thing today. Comic Boom. Welcome, brother.
Right. Well, good to be here with you guys. Looking forward to talking about the hero's journey or lack thereof in certain comic books.
Yeah,
should be fun.
I think it's going to be a really interesting conversation, especially getting three perspectives on the matter. But before we get too deep into it, I do want to prompt everybody watching, if you would, make sure if you enjoy this video to leave a like and subscribe to all three channels. Mine, you can do so clicking the big bad subscribe button down below, and there are links to both of these gentlemen's channels in the description. So make sure you go check them out. And if you want to stay up to date on everything we're doing, our Twitter handles will be linked below. So, before we get in, Taylor29, he says, "Good to see you." Good to see you too.
Hello,
all. But as Boom alluded to, we are discussing the hero's journey in comics, and I think that a lot of folks are probably familiar, at least largely, with the monomyth of the hero's journey by Joseph Campbell, or coined more by Joseph Campbell, and it's kind of this recognition that generally heroes in storytelling take a very similar kind of blueprint to their adventure, to their journey, and their growth as characters. And I think that when Boom brought this topic up, I figured it was an especially interesting conversation because most of the comic book characters that we enjoy are held into, anywhere from 30, 40, 50, 60, 70, even 80 years of continuity to kind of abide by, and not to mention the kind of nature of a periodical will shift the perception of the hero's journey. So this is a really interesting one. So I think that the first thing to kind of discuss here is there a requirement for the hero's journey to tell a comic book superhero story? And Comic Boom, since you were the one that suggested the topic, I'm curious, what are your thoughts on that?
Well, first, I want to be clear that I think most people don't know what the hero's journey is. I think they know what the hero's journey is because a lot of people talk about it. And while I think the three of us know, I think it's important to give it just a very quick Cole's Notes overview.
Sure.
And it consists of basically, it consists, if you want to get technical, it can actually consist of 17 different parts to the story, but it can be really dumbed down to three essential parts. And that is that, and this goes back to the story of myth. All myths throughout time, all stories, all mythologies everything back to the story of book of Genesis. Joseph Campbell wrote a book. He talked about the hero's journey, and it can be broken down to every single hero. Their story consists of at least 3 acts. Number 1 is the departure or the call to adventure. That's the first thing. Second is the initiation, where the hero has to face some trials or tasks. Then they go through an ordeal as they go through these tasks. And then finally, the hero returns to the ordinary world with his reward, and he brings something back to the world to share with his community. It might be something personal to himself or something he can share. So that's really it. It's the call to the adventure. It's the obstacle that he's got to overcome, and then he returns with his reward at the end. That's it in a nutshell. And there's a lot of component parts in between there. And this hero's journey, what makes it so fascinating is that psychologists have used the hero's journey. I read an interesting article called "The Hero's Journey of Self-Transformation." Carl Jung wrote about the hero's journey as well. He alluded to it as well, or at least his writers have built upon it, because the hero's journey is actually used in psychology, because when we overcome obstacles in our life, personal obstacles, we are in fact going through a journey of our own. We're being called to adventure. We're going through an ordeal to overcome a personal obstacle. And then at the end, after we overcome our ordeals, we bring something back with us, usually the lesson. What did we learn? Did we learn from our adversary? Did the battle make us better? Did it make us worse? The hero's journey is something that really it's what makes for good writing and inspires good writing, because this is why they always say, write what you know. The best writers, some of the best stories are written by writers who have a very personal story to tell. That's because they've gone through in their own way, their own hero's journey. And in any event, those are those 3 things in a nutshell: the call to adventure, facing the obstacles and the ordeals, and then returning back to your own world with the reward. That's the hero's journey. And the question that I pose, and that when I thought of the topic to discuss, is in soap opera comic book storytelling, where there's never an ending, where arguably the hero doesn't necessarily ever come back to get his reward, is it possible to have a hero's journey? And because comic books, it's soap opera storytelling, and we don't really have completed stories anymore. Does the hero's journey really? Do you see those 3 elements at a minimum within the stories we're reading? And if so, great. If not, why not? And then maybe at the end, I'm thinking, what are some of the best stories that we can give an example of that we think personify our case?
Yeah, and certainly, like, you bring up, the good question as to whether or not the hero's journey is properly fulfilled. And obviously, the biggest icons in the realm of storytelling we're talking about, like I mentioned earlier, and like you had just mentioned, have such massive continuities. And by the nature of them being periodical stories that kind of string together into one massive myth, can we fulfill it? And I guess I'll put my hat into the ring here and say that I think certainly aspects are fulfilled, but not in totality. I think that in mainline continuity stories, it is almost impossible to completely fulfill the hero's journey just by nature of the type of publishing and continuity. Now, you certainly have those one and done stories that tend to change the history of the character forever. Joey had alluded to that before we went live. And certainly you have Elseworld style stories that are allowed to kind of have that self-contained nature to them. But I don't think the hero's journey is quite as alive in comics. And it's also by nature of the fact that it's not really a medium that accepts a lot of really long form storytelling. We want 6-issue arcs. Sometimes we get so impatient, we want 3-issue arcs because these stories are published monthly. And so compared to like a film or a novel, a film you typically watch in one sitting, you can get the full hero's journey and absorb it as such. In a novel, you can read it at whatever pace you want and experience the full hero's journey. But when it comes to comic books, the periodical format almost makes it impossible in my eyes. Joe, you haven't gotten to speak too much yet. I'm curious, what do you think about that?
Yeah, I mean, as far as my thoughts on the entire subject, I mean, I do think, like, you brought up a really good point that, while a full-on, like, fully rounded hero's journey really isn't possible, definitely aspects of the characters are possible. You can start them in one place at the beginning of the story and have them in a slightly different place at the end. Maybe not in, like I said, in a full circle, but definitely, with like, minor variable changes. I mean, I will say, like, for example, I recently, was going through the Mark Waid Flash books again, and I think that the Wally West story, Born to Run, definitely has aspects of the hero's journey in there, because Wally West is definitely, he goes in to stay with Iris West, his Aunt Iris, because of the things that were going on at home, the inciting incident being issues with his parents, particularly his dad. And then as we go through the story, he's learning lessons from Barry, he's learning lessons from Iris, so that, in the final issue of that story, where it culminates of him going back home and really talking with his dad, and kind of in a big way, like getting over himself to a degree, because he also tended to be a little obnoxious in those situations, and you really do feel like at the very end of the story, he was better for it. So I think in aspects like that, absolutely, the hero's journey is possible. But then again, once you have that kind of established, character arc, where do you take them next? Can the hero's journey happen again in a broader spectrum? And then, of course, it depends on, are you trying to tell this big changing story, that's just gonna rattle the character from here on out, or are you just like you were talking about, and I was saying earlier, or are you just trying to tell a simple serialized adventure story that's really just meant, to be purely entertainment and not, so much analyzed and dissected down to its very core.
Yeah, you make a good point there. Boom, what are you thinking?
Yeah, I would just add to that, and it just building on both what you're saying, and I like the reference you made, Joe, to the Born to Run series, which is absolutely a hero's journey, and I just want to address that. My view is that you can have even in serialized storytelling, with comic book storytelling, you can have multiple story arcs, and each can be its own individual hero's journey. The essence of the hero's journey is some sort of transformation of the hero. It's transformative. At some point, when does this hero gain some kind of enlightenment, some type of character growth, some type of realization about a person, place, a thing, a family member, a loved one, coming to terms with oneself, about past mistakes, about love lost, love gained, any type of transformative process that a character goes through where they've overcome some kind of adversary. And the adversary doesn't have to be necessarily obvious, but it has to be at least there and identifiable, whether that's self-doubt, whether that's some failure, or just plain a super villain. Obviously, that's important. And this is where I think, in my view, your Born to Run example is a great example, because his relationship with his father, that in itself was a transformative. That showed character growth. Whenever there's character growth, usually it comes across because this is the importance of the villain, of the adversary in the hero's journey, because we're not aware of our light until we confront our darkness. And so many people think that if you meditate and then you self-help and you focus on the light, that somehow you're going to become enlightened. And that's not the case. And in fact, even in psychology, and especially in our stories, you never truly appreciate the light until you face your darkness, until you face your greatest fears. And that's what the heroes do in the comic books. And that's what Barry Allen often does. Usually it's the Reverse Flash, or usually it's some Flash enemy, or he's in another crisis and he's facing the Anti-Monitor or something. But with Barry Allen, as to use that as an example, that adversary of another multiversal crisis is really him questioning. I mean, it's isn't it something that Barry Allen and Joshua Williamson does this? And I've been critical of Williamson, but I'll give him props for this. Joshua Williamson often has Barry Allen defeat his enemies by remembering something he loves or embracing his loved ones and family. And Barry Allen often becomes transformed, symbolized by his connection to the Speed Force. And I think that's very interesting. And every arc sort of has that. I think it's overdone, but I think it's there, right?
Yeah, I mean,
just look at his face right now. Just look at his face, Boom. Have you said that?
Yeah, I have a really shitty poker face. Granted, I'm a blackjack guy anyways. But, here's the thing. It's kind of addressing the first part and referencing the hero's journey as a transformation. I think that the hero's journey is very much a specific process to achieve character transformation. So I don't necessarily think that character transformation always implies the hero's journey as outlined by Joseph Campbell. Because I think that you can certainly have a transformative experience for a character without, following the entirety of the hero's journey, anywhere from 12 to 17 steps, depending on who you're talking to. And regarding Williamson's Flash, I think there's certainly an element of redundancy in how he does it. The victory is always the same methodology the whole time. And there's something to be said about that, because the hero's journey, the more we study the hero's journey and the more people really look into it, we learn that it's not as hard and fast. Like, for example, the element of the mentor figure, has kind of evolved past meeting a physical mentor figure. It can be experiencing somebody else's thoughts and kind of reintegrating them. It can be, remembering past experiences. Or if you go into the sort of reward on the direction of quote unquote the resurrection step, right? It can be knowledge, it can be love, it can be a new tool, it can be a general kind of revelation. So I think that, for example, Williamson is a tough pull, because I don't think it's necessarily a successful use of the hero's journey. I think he's often, again, very redundant in the way that he executes, and it makes it feel a little bit too like set in stone, and not in the best way necessarily. Before we move forward, I do want to address a couple of the folks in the chat. We have some Okie Dude asking us how we're doing. I'm okay. I'm chatting with two of my pals about things that don't exist, and that's always a good time.
Absolutely.
Tahilum returned. Welcome back, buddy. Skip and Tosh, a new member. He says, "Hey y'all, what's up, man? Thanks for joining us." Tavia Smoka also joining us, just giving a brief hello. So yeah, just wanted to say hello. Thank you to everybody who's joining us live right now. But yeah, so I think that the hero's journey is, in a way, it's going to sound paradoxical. It is specific in the sense that I think a general blueprint needs to be followed, but in the same sense that it allows for a little bit of ambiguity in the execution of the blueprint. So yeah, the thing is, I don't think the hero's journey needs to be 100% fulfilled to see that transformation, personally. And you do have stories that can certainly accomplish it, but it doesn't always play as well. And it's not always easy to execute as cleanly in comic books, especially. Oh,
Boom! I think we lost your sound.
Sorry, yeah, that was my fault.
Okay.
I was going to say it. Just a quick point that it is a journey. It's a hero's journey after all. So it doesn't necessarily end, but obviously with Williamson, we can question I agree that I find him to be redundant. I find him to be telling the same story, but I will acknowledge that it has a hero's journey part of it, which, quite frankly, I would argue that The Flash is one of DC's better selling comic books. And despite the redundancy, the fact that Williamson has stuck to a hero's journey kind of formula, I think, is one of the reasons why he's been one of the more consistent sellers for DC. People are, but I just wish that maybe he would, some of the lessons that Barry, he keeps relearning the same lessons. He seems to be going through the same hero's journey over and over again. I'd like to see him go on a different one and maybe go to the next level, because he seems to always take 2 steps forward and 1 step back. But I think that, in any event, I don't know. Actually, I want to hear your comment, Joe, because I know you're the Flash fan here. So what do you think?
Yeah, I mean, I'm definitely a big Flash fan, and I've always professed to both of you that I do enjoy Williamson's run. I think that the stories he tells are fun. Even if you take a step back, look at some of the past runs, and it's like, okay, maybe not as good as John's, maybe not as good as or Morrison or anything like that. But I've relatively found the stories to be fun adventure stories. As far as as far as like the hero's journey goes, I see what you're saying there too, Boom, that he does try to follow it to a degree, but yeah, it does kind of get lost a little bit because he is doing the same things kind of over and over and over again. And through that, if there's no change, is it really truly a hero's journey? I guess you could say, because I will say, I don't really think once in Williamson's run did I actually ever feel like Barry Allen changed for the better. I often do find him going back and making the same mistakes constantly. For the example with the character Mina, who is like the negative Flash, and stuff like that. As much as I liked the dynamic of giving him another female speedster he can relate to, just because, he's kind of distancing himself from Iris at this point. Like I said, I like the dynamic, but the execution that followed with, her betrayal and then him just easily accepting her and embracing her back with open arms as if she never betrayed him in the first place. I didn't really care for, those kinds of aspects in the story. And with that, I'm like, well, if she did this the last time you met, logic dictates that you shouldn't be so trusting this time, yet you are. And that tells me that this Barry Allen, in terms of the story, just wasn't learning from those past mistakes. And again, can you really call that in and itself a hero's journey? I think Williamson definitely tries to do the hero's journey, but he doesn't allow that time. He doesn't allow that change to take place in order for it to be a complete thought.
I think you said it excellently right there, Joe. And the important thing is that in that last step, the kind of return to the ordinary world, there has to be something learned by the character. That is ultimately the conclusion of the hero's journey, at least for the scope of one rotation, right? If we look at it as a cyclical thing that allows us to continue to tell stories, the end of a rotation is a resolution, a knowledge, a newfound trait that a character is going to learn throughout their journey. And I think that's part of what really turned me off to Williamson's Flash, amongst a couple of other kind of writing critiques. It is that I felt like the Flash wasn't learning anything. And it was even more kind of aggravating because we were going through the same journey multiple times and still not learning anything. And, I've talked extensively about how I like Barry Allen just as much as I like Wally West. I know I'm a minority in that, but it's because of Barry's tendency and ability to be intuitive, and we're certainly not getting that across this long spanning run. The only form of quote unquote intuition I've seen is the Deus Ex Machina thinking, where it's just like problem. Barry gets smacked around suddenly because he's a detective. He knows the answer with no actual path, to that answer. So it's certainly an interesting thing. And it's the main reason why I use Barry and Wally as the thumbnail for this video, because their heroes' journeys cumulatively are so different from one another, and yet they both achieve the full spectrum of the hero's journey, across their continuity. And obviously, Born to Run being a great story to introduce to this conversation because it is, for all intents and purposes, the full scope of his journey. And then you get into is it the same arc where they introduce his like hypothetical son?
The hypothetical son was just before Born to Run. It was the annual number 4, I believe.
Yeah, which is a great story, by the way, for anybody who's looking for like some good Flash. Was it just that one issue?
Yeah, it was just that. It was just that one issue. It's the one. What is it? During the whole 2001 Armageddon, it was a kind of a tie-in or prelude to the 2001 Armageddon. And Wave Rider saw the future, but unfortunately, his touch kind of messed up that timeline, so that it never happened. And it was very interesting because it's also the one and only time you saw a speedster not have twins.
True, very true. And a quick plug: Joey actually is doing a really excellent series of videos on Mark Waid's Flash, and he's covered both of those stories now. So make sure you guys go click the link in the description, go check those videos out because they're sweet.
Yeah, this week I got the last one of that book one coming out.
Awesome.
This next week, so
looking forward to it, brother. But yeah, it's an interesting debacle. You were going to say something, Boom?
Yeah, I just want to. You guys have segued perfectly into. I just want to read a quote because I think it segues off what you guys are saying, and it's. You could say that much of therapy is about the conflict between cultural mythology and individual mythology, or about the conflict between different personal myths. So here it is. Less do we know that we follow him whose shadow we are as our own shadow follows us. We usually have an idea about who our shadows are, but whose shadow am I? That is the hero's journey to discover. The dragons and trolls and monsters that we encounter make up a mosaic that, taken together, forms the totality of who we truly are. They are not, as it turns out, separate from us. Indeed, we have met the enemy, and he is us. It's said that our deepest fears are like dragons guarding our deepest treasure. I say that because I think one of my criticisms, because we think of the hero always overcoming his shadows, but the deeper revelation of the hero's journey is that the hero becomes a shadow to other people because he brings the reward back. So which characters consider the hero the shadow? Who is the hero of the shadow too? So when I look at the Flash, for example, all right, the hero has all these shadows. He's got all these things he's got to overcome. But which characters consider the Flash the shadow? Like whose shadow is he? And that's an interesting question as well, especially when you get into the dynamic of Barry and Wally. And it's because when you bring back the reward, sometimes what the hero brings back, the hero can become the bad guy, And that's what's interesting about it is that even when a hero fails or they come back to the world and they think they've won, but sometimes they can become corrupted because they take the wrong lessons. And if you might have overcome your own shadows, but if you don't become the hero to somebody else, or you become a shadow to somebody else, that creates the problem as well. Am I making any sense there?
No, you make a really excellent point, and it's really exemplified by the institution of legacy characters in comics. You used perhaps one of the most famous between Barry and Wally specifically. And I'll selfishly include my favorite character. Batman obviously has the most extensive network of supporting characters in all of comics, kind of subtly casting a shadow. And you have the kind of, I don't want to say manipulation because it has a negative connotation. So when I say manipulation, I just kind of mean the transformation of, for example, of Batman's kind of motivation to be a hero and how you can see it distributed amongst his followers, right? I mean, in the Robin 80th anniversary, we have the James Tynion story in particular, where it explores kind of the differences between all of the main Robins and how they've taken Bruce Wayne, Batman's teachings, his motivations, the drive, and made it their own. And certainly, there was a time where Jason Todd, Red Hood, when he was first revived and brought back into continuity, he kind of molested that, right, and turned it into this war, this murderous war on crime. And he, in turn, because of that manipulation, became a villain himself. But yeah, can everybody hear okay?
Yeah, sorry, I'm
Yeah.
just on mute there. One of the another part of that transformation, and we see it a lot in comic books, is at the end of the journey, there's always that transformation from I to we. So, in other words, I can't, but we can. So the idea of coming together and it's overcoming those obstacles, and you see this a lot, particularly in the events, in the big events, where often usually there's a degree of selfishness because people are not working together. And then at the end, they realize that they're stronger together than they were apart. That's also a part of the hero's journey. It's a little bit more of an obvious one in terms of, they're all it. Sometimes, let's face it, I think comic books, where the most cliche comic books are the ones that have the most obvious hero's journey, where you got an obvious bad guy, you all get together, you fight the bad guy, you win, you get the reward, you get the girl, and you take off. That's the hero's journey. The best stories, though, and my favorite by far is the journey of Kingdom Come Superman and Kingdom Come, where arguably he was already the hero, but it was his own shadows that did him in, and he went on yet another journey. And Superman, he lost his wife. Magog killed the Joker. The citizens of the world chose Magog over Superman. Superman was ashamed of the people that they would choose somebody who would kill over someone who wouldn't. He secludes himself in the fortress. He abandons humanity. The heroes then become more narcissistic, more cruel, more hardline. And he comes back, and his call to adventure is to sort of save humanity, but also to basically save some idealized version of what the heroic ideal is. But he has his own doubts, and the doubts that he has, he doesn't have a lot of hope for humanity. And Superman's, I guess you could call his redemption at the end. I always viewed it as him when he says to Billy Batson, you have a connection between the hero and humanity. You decide if you want to. You decide whether or not you're going to stop that nuclear bomb from killing us all. You make the call, and he does. And it's that gift that they bring to humanity. I mean, he chooses. They chose life, and they made a difficult choice, but they made it. And I just find that to be, again, that there are so many characters in Kingdom Come that went through their own hero's journey. Even Lex Luthor in Kingdom Come, Batman, Wonder Woman, who was a killer, really was a badass, and so many characters had their own different versions of the hero's journey, and subtle and nuanced, and that's what makes it such a brilliant story. And I'm sure I butchered my explanation of Kingdom Come Superman, because there's 10 different ways to interpret that journey that he was on. But that's just, that's what masterful storytelling is. And I still insist that the best comic book stories, whether it's Dark Knight Returns or Daredevil Born Again, they're the perfect reflection of the hero's journey.
Yeah. You bring up a specifically interesting point about living in the shadow of your own memory, which I think is something that you bring up very eloquently with Superman in Kingdom Come, because very clearly he has this pedestal to live up to that he himself set. And after being so far removed from the world and returning, I think he definitely felt the shadows, the stressors, the kind of the fear of not being able to reacclimate himself to that level. Joey, you were going to say something?
Oh yeah, no, I was just gonna say I think that was a very good point. Well illustrated. And you touched on that too in a very good way. It's Superman just coming back to the public eye again. Is like, how did I do it the first time? How do I do it again? Can I just get the trust of the public back? Can I live up to my own expectations because I did it so well the first time around? And, that definitely made it, that's one of the elements that made it a very, very compelling story for sure.
Yeah, absolutely. And Tevia in the chat brings up a question. He wants to know Wasn't the Flash shadow Jay Garrick? And I would say no, simply considering the fact that Barry Allen's introduction and his kind of impetus behind becoming the Flash was in a separate reality. As things kind of span on, and we have a post-crisis situation where the original Golden Age characters kind of became legacy characters. But even then, I don't think that Barry is inherently as influenced by, for example, Jay Garrick as Wally was to Barry. And I don't think it necessarily needs to be that same level of idolization that Wally had for Barry. But I wouldn't necessarily say that Jay Garrick is the shadow by which other Flashes amount to. I would argue that it's Barry. Barry is kind of the pinnacle Flash. And I think by virtue, especially of him kind of being killed off perhaps earlier than people wanted, it almost elevated the appearance of Barry Allen and who he was as a character.
Yeah, I would, definitely there's definitely some truth to that. I mean, because like when you look at Barry Allen, I mean, to a degree, there was, pre-crisis, there was definitely a level of inspiration that Barry took from Jay, just more so in terms of like, the fact that they were comic books he enjoyed as a kid. That's where he got his name, The Flash, from. He wanted to idolize his favorite comic book character before he realized, he technically existed in another reality. But, I mean, Barry pretty much by that methodology set his own standard for how to be the Flash. And, definitely, I think definitely succeeded as, becoming like really owning the name The Flash in his own right. Whereas, the difference is Wally growing up in the same reality as Barry Allen, The Flash, who idolized him and was more a true shadow because he actually got to learn from him. Barry had to learn how to use his powers on his own. And, and even then when you find out later on that, Barry's technically the one that created the Speed Force, and kind of gave him, I think it was one that basically gave himself the powers. Was like, okay, gonna go through time real quick, make sure I become the Flash. So, time can happen.
I think it's worth pointing, just building on what you're saying, that when you have a legacy character like the Flash, whether obviously whichever Flash comes first is relevant, but all the subsequent Flashes, Jay Garrick did come first. Arguably, you could say Flash or Barry Allen was familiar with Jay Garrick in the pages of a comic book from a previous, universe. But whenever there's a legacy character, you're always influenced by the shadows of that character. Like even John Kent. John Kent is influenced by the shadow of his father, by the memory of or the shadow of his dad and the legacy of his dad. You can't escape that. And I'm a firm believer of that we all, even with our most deepest and difficult questions that we have for ourselves, that we have the answer and the wisdom within us. And what the call to adventure is in myth and in our own lives is, how often do we not know the answer to something and we've screwed up or we've done something wrong or where we have the insight, but isn't it funny how sometimes what happens to give us the insight? Well, we either run into a mentor, or we have an adventure, or we hit rock bottom. We face an adversary and we discover a strength we never had in defending ourselves. That's the call to adventure. That's the shadows that we face. And sometimes they're within us. Sometimes they're forced upon us. And that's the essence of story. And so really, the analogy between therapy and writing and a story is right there in so many ways. And it's no surprise that some of the best stories arise from our own traumas.
Yeah, absolutely. And there's an interesting kind of way to look at comics in particular structurally and how they kind of pursue the hero's journey, because you don't always get to use the traditional 3-act storytelling. And interestingly enough, the hero's journey is set within 3-act storytelling. And you can look at, we're using the example of the Flashes and how if you look at Act 1 of Wally becoming the Flash, right, his first trial was living up to the mantle of Barry. And his first real success and that kind of understanding of his strength and his ability, and that first kind of kindle of a reward, or in his specific terms, the reward of like wisdom and acceptance, was realizing he was holding himself back the whole time because he was afraid to tarnish the legacy that, came before him. And after acknowledging that, he became, I mean, it's not even an argument. He became the most powerful Flash in the history of comic books. So it certainly brings up an interesting conversation in how you can kind of look at the different structures of various storytelling mediums and how they can individually pursue, not only that act structure, but moving forward, obviously, the hero's journey and the monomyth. And there's an interesting question here in the live chat here by Skip and Tosh, and he wants to know if there's room for the hero's journey to evolve. And I think it certainly has over the years, because the kind of definitions by which we assign to the different steps of the hero's journey have become I wouldn't say more general, but they've become more accepting. If you, for example, are to take a look at the kind of the threshold, right? The first threshold, the resistance in the story into the kind of like they're like into the atonement, into the lessons learned. It's evolved from simply, defeating the monster to maybe overcoming an internal conflict, kind of resolving some type of knowledge, healing a relationship, forming a relationship. There are so many different ways we can define that now. So yeah, definitely. I think the hero's journey has evolved and continues to evolve. What do you guys think?
Well, I mean, personally for me, yeah, I definitely think that there's always room, for improvement. Like you said, the hero's journey is great as a blueprint, but this a lot of the more interior steps can be malleable in terms of its own interpretation, and writers can definitely take stories in different directions and stuff like that. Like I know, we keep coming, I keep bringing it back to the Flash, but like, say for example, one of his biggest stories, Flashpoint, was, also, like that was a good example of a hero's journey, even though we come to find out that it was Barry that was responsible for inciting his own journey in the first place. And even though he has those external forces that, are in his way and stuff like that, like, the Reverse Flash and like what's going on with the world in itself. And he's trying to fix all this. And then, but really the crux of the story, it was all an internal struggle of him just really finally learning to let go of, the loss of his mother and stuff like that. And coming to understand the fact that he just can't change everything, and even in the I can't remember if the line was in the book, but I know it was definitely in the movie where it was, Barry's mom and then Iris telling him, try to accept the things you can't change, but have courage to change the things that you can, which I think is a very good message, when it comes to the hero's journey in itself as well.
Yeah, you bring up an excellent point, and I think there's almost more weight added to Flashpoint because the impetus behind his journey and his struggle was his own mistake, right? His own flaw. And it almost makes it a little bit more redeeming in his kind of character rebirth and the lessons learned at the end of the story, because he not only has to reconcile with the fact that there's this massive challenge in front of him, but he also has to reconcile, with the fact that it was his doing. It was entirely his fault. There's nobody else to blame but himself. The entire story, or at least the majority of it, 60% of the story, is him kind of looking at Eobard Thawne, the Reverse Flash, and trying to process his grief by blaming him, when you find out in reality, no, he just took advantage of Barry's mistake.
Absolutely, and it comes down to, it's easier to blame others than it is to blame yourself. So I think that was, a very, very good, way for Barry to, really look at his own internal struggles with, with the fact of he just can't let go.
Yeah.
One of the criticisms of the hero's journey, and just to build on Skip and Tosh's question, I'm going to read something into his question that he didn't have there, but he says, is there room for the hero's journey to evolve? One way to interpret his question is, well, what's wrong with the hero's journey now? There's been there's been at least two criticisms that have been made of the hero's journey when I was doing a little bit of research into it. And the first one was that it's cliche, is that it's been done again and again and again, and it's hurt storytelling. That's been one of the criticisms of it, that the formula, it's too formulaic, and that a prime example of how bad it's gotten is comic books, because it's the same old trope again and again and again, and it just gets tiresome after a while, and it's hurt storytelling because it puts the storyteller in a certain frame of mind and they can't think outside of it. And so when he asks, is there room for the hero's journey to evolve? Well, if you think that it's been cliched storytelling, I would say, yes, there's certainly room for the hero's journey to evolve. But I would say, and I would argue that any exception to the hero's journey proves the rule. Because no matter what story you tell, we can easily utilize the language and the 17 parts of the hero's journey to prove that any story to be compelling is going to have drama. If you got drama, you got shadows. If you got a realization or enlightenment, you've got the return home. You got the call to the adventure. It's there in all our lives. I mean, there's a wonderful quote that a myth is something that never was, but always is. Myth is the dream of the people. The dream is the myth of the individual. Myths have always been understood in societies as stories, and they're profoundly significant. And that is a huge, huge, huge aspect of the hero's journey, and you just can't escape it. Finally, the second criticism of the hero's journey is that, interestingly enough, some people think it's too masculine, that it's predominantly it's a white man's journey, and there's an ethnocentric sort of European bias to it, grounded mostly in European myth. But I think that's a weak argument.
I agree. I think the second argument is certainly kind of, I mean, I would even venture to completely disregard it, because I think it's somebody like people just trying to victimize themselves in storytelling and just being kind of uncooperative to known successful kind of blueprints of storytelling. And I think certainly like the evolution of the hero's journey comes in the nature of the fact that it's become so much more inclusive, in what could be considered different executions of each of the steps. It's not so tried and true anymore. And ultimately they kind of, if done successfully, will still kind of culminate into the hero learning a lesson and it feeling organic. I brought up before a couple specifics on how, different steps in the hero's journey have kind of been reopened to new processes of thought. And there's a lot of interesting ways to look at it. And I think that, sure, yeah, if you have people like Williamson, for example, who are making the same mistakes with the hero's journey, yes, it will become redundant. Yes, it will become boring and rigid. But there are certainly ways to kind of take advantage of how the hero's journey has evolved and reconfigure it in different ways. The Dark Knight Returns is a really good one because, really the main crux of that story isn't as much about the protagonist learning a lesson. Batman, he certainly evolves throughout the story, but there isn't a massive linchpin that irrevocably changes Bruce Wayne in that kind of continuity. It's how Bruce Wayne changes the perception of the world around him, right? Like that's the biggest impact of The Dark Knight Returns. He ultimately kind of culminating through the metaphor of Superman, realizing that Bruce faked his death, knowing that Bruce kind of has the proper insight and the proper motives to operate the way he does, and knowing that he was wrong for combating Bruce. So there are interesting ways to kind of utilize those steps in different directions.
I got a question for you guys. A question, and that is, think of a storyline that you don't like, a story arc that you don't like, and think about the hero's journey. And can you come up with the reason, if you compare the reason why you don't like that storyline? Can you reference the hero's journey as maybe to help you answer why you didn't like that story?
Sure. I mean, I think that there's certainly, I mean, we were, just to, and not to beat over the head with it, but we talked about Williamson's Flash. Where does Williamson's Flash fail? The character doesn't learn, right? He's had what, 80 something issues now. It doesn't feel like Barry's grown over 80 issues. And there's a redundancy, right? He's not taking advantage of how the hero story has evolved, and he's not kind of manipulating different kind of points in the hero's journey to reflect a new story, right? And that's why they feel the same and redundant. So although he's quote unquote following a majority of a very rigid blueprint to the hero's journey, it's not particularly well executed, and that's where it really failed for me. Aside from a couple of other, like I said, more intricate writing critiques, generally as a larger story and for a journey for the protagonist, I think that's a really good example of a poor use of the hero's journey.
Mm-hmm.
I'm gonna deviate some. I'll deviate from Flash, and I'll just use Young Justice as an example. I think that with Bendis's Young Justice specifically, there's nothing at stake. There was not a call to adventure. At the big issue 1 of Young Justice, they all these random characters met and they were suddenly thrown into the multiverse. Now that might seem on the surface to be a call to adventure, but it really wasn't, because the adventure wasn't defined. Nobody had a goal. They didn't know each other. Nobody had a goal. We didn't know who the adversary was. Still don't know. There was no adversary. There was no shadows. The characters themselves there was confusion. They weren't supposed to exist. The timelines were all over the place. So right away we didn't have we had an ill-defined call to adventure, but it wasn't really adventurous. It was more confusing. We had undefined shadows. We had an undefined adversary. And we never really did have a return home. When we had a return home, there was no gift. There was no realization. They had no enlightenment.
Most importantly, and this is why I dropped off after like 3 issues, is because he missed the most, aside from all of those very valid critiques you make and misfires, none of it was character driven. It was poorly plot driven. There wasn't any inciting incident with these characters that drives them to face the challenge. It was just there because he needed a story. And that is the biggest flaw in creating any sort of, or in trying to pursue a hero's journey, is that it is a character-driven pathway.
What about you, Joe?
Oof. Yeah, see, here's a tough one. I've never really thought about the hero's journey in terms of like, some of the stories that I didn't like. So that one might be a little tough for me to answer. I mean, probably one of the ones I could maybe throw out there would be, Bendis' Superman, for example, would be probably definitely one of the ones I would figure the most, just because, throughout his run and some of the choices he made through some of his stories, the goal of the characters oftentimes are not exactly clear. Like, for example, I read the storyline where Superman decided to reveal his identity, the truth storyline that was, of course, done in the New 52, just not too long ago, but there he is doing it again. And the goals of Superman didn't seem particularly clear as to why he wanted to do it. It was a way to throw his wife into the line of fire, throw his son into the line of fire, of just, media, possibly enemies and things like that. And just all around, it was something that I just don't know what he was trying to do with that particular plot point. And maybe in terms of the hero's journey, he was trying to change Superman, aka Clark Kent, maybe trying to get him to relate just a little bit more. But if that was the intention, it definitely did not work.
Yeah, I mean, it's really funny because Bendis teaches writing for comics in Chicago, and he's single-handedly in the last couple of years provided a masterclass in how to not write comics. which is great. I'm sure it's very useful as material for his students. I'm not sure that's the way he's framing it, but yeah, I mean, the thing is that it's not, again, it's not character driven, and you can have good plot driven story, but ultimately, I mean, it's bad plot. So the plot isn't strong enough to keep that story afloat and to keep his overarching narrative. I mean, you make good points about how he deliberately makes uncharacteristic choices for Superman to make. And they ultimately result in some really wonky storytelling that push these characters in really odd directions, and I hear in interviews and he's actually really interesting to listen to when he talks story, believe it or not. But the thing that he ultimately, I don't think, recognizes in these conversations is he talks about wanting to shake things up and wanting to change and provide new and exciting directions. New and exciting directions need to be predicated on something that already exists, right? Like there needs to be relevant character choices made that impact the trajectory of those stories and impact, where the character is going to go from there. And that's certainly not happening, right? Like Superman would not choose to reveal his secret identity unless absolutely necessary. And there's something to be said about how, and I agree with the argument that a lot make, that depriving Superman of his identity as Clark Kent also deprives him of very specific aspects of his humanity, even though he's learned what it means to be human and is perhaps more versed in it than anybody else on the face of the earth. I think that it's still very easy for him to be removed from it. We talked about Kingdom Come, for example. What happens when Superman is removed from his humanity for 20 years? He loses his gentle nature, and he becomes very objective driven, which is inherently not part of who Superman is. And it's executed well by Mark Waid because there are choices and there are mistakes made by the character, of course, because that's what drives story. But they are relevant mistakes that one could kind of accept Superman making, right? Like you can put yourself in the head of Superman and think, wow, if I was the symbol of hope, for all of these years, and I gave them everything, my all, and yet at the end of the day, they chose somebody who I deem, an unworthy successor to go beyond me. How does that impact me? I become invalidated. And there's a relevant choice made there that feels like a legitimate qualm that the character would have, unlike in Bendis's Superman, him deciding to do it, to set up whatever and the Legion of Superheroes. It's not a character driven decision.
Yeah, I definitely agree to that, and then to just to add a little more into that, it's like when Bendis even jumped on Superman in the first place, it's okay, I want to shake things up, I want to take him in directions he had never gone before, at least in his eyes, without I think really seeing that Superman was already heading in those kinds of directions. Because one thing that like Tomasi did really well was exploring Superman through the relationship with his son and being a father, trying to raise him. And so when Bendis came on and aged up John, really deprived us of potentially years worth of eye-opening change for Superman as a character, both on his Kryptonian and human levels.
Yeah, you make some very good points.
I would, what I found really curious about the story of Rogol Zaar is that Bendis spent an entire year doing nothing but setting up John Kent's call to adventure.
Mm-hmm.
You know what I mean? John Kent's call to adventure, to put John Kent on a hero's journey to the 31st century. His call to adventure took an entire year and a half to create. And that year and a half leading to the call of adventure, that was not a very satisfying story, because that in itself never really had a lot of hero's journey there. Now, but let me be in defense of Bendis for a second. This is what Bendis would say.
Defending Bendis. Wow.
Rogol Zaar came and destroyed Kandor, the city of Kandor. Okay, right. And wants to kill all the Kryptonians. Well, boom, cue your call to adventure. You got your heroes that they're facing their darkest shadows now. Rogol Zaar potentially linked to Jor-El, potentially linked to a scheme to destroy Krypton many years ago. And there's a galactic conspiracy, a call to adventure to stop Rogol Zaar and get to the bottom of the conspiracy. Supergirl goes off looking for Rogol Zaar. Superman has to protect Earth. John is also on Earth, and meanwhile, Jor-El wants to take John on another space adventure. So that's the call to adventure. And so then the call to adventure, what are the obstacles they face? Well, numerous obstacles to face Rogol Zaar, and there's chaos and everything else. And then at the end, the realization that they finally defeat Rogol Zaar, and the realization, okay, I'm stretching it here. I don't really know what the gift that Clark has, the gift that Superman has, is he decides that's his primary motivation to give up his secret identity, right? I mean, that's what it was. He figured, his son inspires Unity Day. It's open. It's about being open and honest, and everybody unifying, and having no more secrets, because secrets is what destroyed Krypton. So the realization that Superman had, the enlightenment, the gift that he brings back to humanity, is his identity, which is actually his shadow. And so now the question becomes, in evolving the hero's journey, is Superman's shadow now has Superman's gift might become the curse, because now that he's revealed his secret identity, it's going to potentially curse his own family and his friends and might put them in harm's way. So in a sense, while I may not like the hero's journey, the journey that Bendis put him on, I can't deny that I think maybe it's there. I don't like the story.
Well, there's something to be said about execution, right? Like, you can have something in practice and totally not execute. And, I'll make like an analogy to cooking, right? Like, we all know what a grilled cheese tastes like, but if Bendis takes a fucking block of cheese and puts it between two pieces of bread and throws it on the pan, sure. Is it technically a grilled cheese? Yes. Does it taste like shit? Absolutely. There's something to say about proportion, mixture, timing, pacing, that's, you can make analogous comparisons in storytelling in comics, right? There's first of all, you even bring it up in the beginning, the pacing is fucking off. It took him 1.5 years to set up one step of the hero's journey. There is and there's certainly some leeway for different creators to decide how they want to pace it, but ultimately there needs to be a rhythm, which there is none, right? There's a music to it in a way, and there's something to be said about that. He deprives you of various elements, and then kind of tries to poke his head in there and make comparisons that aren't necessarily relevant. It's not really a proper completion of any of the steps, and he moves on anyways. Not to mention comic books in particular, especially like the regularly main continuity syndicated stuff, have predicated history and continuity and characterization that you have to some degree appeal to, which he does not, which does make comic books, Big Two comics in particular, and the hero's journey for those characters a little bit more different than the traditional hero's journey, because it's unlike anything else in that way, which Bendis clearly doesn't respect. I mean, even if Bendis were making this stride in a solo film, if this is the first time we're meeting Superman, I still think it's poorly done because the execution's not there on every level.
Oh yeah, I definitely agree with that, because like really when you look at the hero's journey too, and what's one of the most important aspects of the hero's journey, it's the ending. It's the end of the story. What did they learn? What did they accomplish their goals? What are they bringing back that improve them in any kind of capacity, even just a tiny bit? And when it comes to like the way Bendis sets up his stories, and you finally get to the end of some of those stories, and there's no payoff really. It's just oftentimes left with a lot more questions, or you're just left with why is this even happening sort of scenario. Like in Young Justice, not Young Justice, but Legion of Superheroes, it was stated in one of the issues that John Kent, the reason why he's in the future is because they're preparing him to become the one true Superman. History's not going to remember Clark Kent's Superman. History is going to remember Jonathan Kent's Superman, according to Bendis.
Oh,
And so, now Bendis has put himself in a very interesting position because now he's got to pay that off in a really big way that's going to make the readers go, yeah, absolutely. Like 80 plus years of Superman, just forget that, man, Lily. We're focusing right here now.
Yeah, I mean, we know he won't, right? Because it's just going to be at the end of this. Because Bendis, Jonathan Kent is now the only Superman that ever mattered, even though he's been Superman for 0 minutes ever. It's an odd. It's such an odd scenario, and it makes me. And there's something to bring up too about like if you want to talk about lessons learned and this translates to this in some weird way. He's also doing it at the detriment of the supporting cast, which isn't in a detriment of the characters experiencing loss or the characters experiencing drama. It is literally at the detriment of their characterization and who they are, right? Like, we're not abiding by the universe that already exists. It's Bendis reshaping everything. And there's something to be said. I just listened to an interview like a week ago with him in Word Balloon where he's like, DC hired me to invent all these cool new characters. Dog, if you're writing stories to invent new characters, you shouldn't be writing stories. That's not how stories work. And you know what I mean? I'm not the foremost expert on writing, but if a college student can tell you that and you're the professional, there's something wrong.
Yeah. there's definitely a lot of truth to that as well. But I Bendis.
Go ahead, sorry, Joe.
Oh no! I was just saying, yeah. Like, at the end of the day, it's Bendis.
Because Bendis.
Yeah. I do note that if Bendis was, because I listened to that the Bendis tapes on John Cheech's Word Balloon as well, and he's mentioned that before where he was supposed to create some characters for DC. Well, I don't think he's created a lot. I mean, he created Naomi. I don't know. I mean, he's redefined. I mean, he's ignored the characterization. I mean, if I didn't know better, I think he misunderstood them, and he maybe heard them say, Bendis, we want you to ignore all the established characterization and just do whatever the hell you want. That I believe. But I mean,
Lois Lane.
He's only invented Naomi so far. So I mean, I don't know. I say this.
He's invented more. He invented Lois. He invented the woman that ended up being Red Cloud. He invented Rogol Zar. He invented that other new firefighter chick that was supposed to be a really stupid way to. The thing is, and you are speaking exactly to one of the issues here, is that he's creating characters, but he's not spending time with any of them. He's just creating them to populate a world where Bendis gets royalties anytime they're used. There's no story incentive for any of them. There's no reason for me to care about any of them. And you forgetting about them is exactly my point, is that none of them are lasting. There's no story. There's nothing to drive these characters besides the fact that Bendis wants money.
Yeah, I mean, when's the next time we're even going to see half of these characters? I see Rogol Zar pop up every now and again, and sort of like just that past tense, like in Joshua Williamson's Batman Superman run, with the resurrection of the Kandorians and stuff. Rogol Zar was mentioned one panel in passing just to say, okay, this happened, moving on. And I really think that a lot of the characters that Bendis is creating for the Superman book, particularly, are just going to be relegated to that only. Is just they're going to get mentioned in passing whenever the next writer is told, "Hey, you got to reference this one book."
Well, I will say this: it all comes down to with Bendis. So much would have been better if there had been more of a payoff with Rogol Zar. If he'd have felt like a better adversary instead of just another glorified insane monster. That was that really hurt him. The big thing for me with Bendis, I mean, obviously there's many things that bother me about Bendis, but I think it would have really been helpful if he hasn't come up with a good adversary for anybody. That's so important. What is the adversary? Who is the enemy here? Who's the bad guy? Because sometimes it's that old cliche, but it's so true. A hero is only as good as the bad guy. And that's because, to put it in terms of the hero's journey mythology, you're only as the lesson that you learn is only as powerful as your adversary that you overcome. And the way that your adversary makes you think, and the road that your adversary puts you on and tests you. And really, who's Leviathan tested? I mean, he tested Batgirl, and Batgirl kicked his ass off panel. I mean, like, this is what I mean. Like Leviathan, really? Or the Invisible Mafia? Even the name, the Invisible Mafia. I guess we can't see it. I mean, we're not. Come on. I mean, I'm joking, my point's still made that, he's sort of missed the mark on that, because if you really want to drive home, because I really do think in to give Bendis his due for, and I think it was Skipintosh said it in the chat that Bendis has good ideas. It's just in the execution, and we've all said that, and we all agree with that. And because I do think there's a lot of potential with the Invisible Mafia. I think Leviathan, he could be. The DC universe does need a Doctor Doom or kind of Magneto in the DC universe. We do need more sophisticated villains in the DC universe. We could benefit from that. I really do believe that. And so I think he's on the right track. He just hasn't created the right hero's journey, or hey, we can call it a villain's journey. Just another quick point here. At the end of the hero's journey, it can be progressive or it can be regressive. The hero doesn't always have to. Sometimes you can fail at the end and still have a compelling story. And that doesn't mean that it's not a hero's journey. I would just say that you can circumvent, or what's the word, subvert expectations. If you subvert the hero's journey, you can have a really compelling tale as well, which Mark Waid did with Incorruptible, for example.
Yeah, sure. Yeah. But the one thing I'll say, and I'm sure, Joey, because you've taken courses on creative writing and such, the one thing I can add testament to is the fact that ideas, like big grand ideas, truthfully aren't what matter in writing. Right? The execution is what matters, because you can turn a run-of-the-mill idea and make it compelling by using the character's perspective of the world, how they're interacting with their world, and make it interesting. That's why you see multitudes of reiterations of classic stories, from even down to who the characters are, their names, like how they operate, and changing it and creating these evergreen stories that certainly deviate from the original myth, but utilize a lot of what's already there because the execution is so strong, right? Like Bendis is making mistakes that I would see someone of my caliber making. Maybe I have a good idea, but I don't know how to execute it properly. It feels like elements of inexperience, right? Like that's the one thing I've learned through, you know what I mean? Like I haven't done anything huge, right? But I've started writing a novel. I've finished a novella. I've written a teleplay script, right? And the one thing I've learned is my biggest fear is not being able to execute, right? Because my ideas have, to some degree or another, been done by somebody else before in some way. So the idea isn't really what sets you apart, is your ability to operate on them, right? Like here's my example. You can have a good idea and have poor execution and it's a bad story. You can have a great execution and the idea that, your neighbor had about a story, and just do it really well, and it's a good story. And there's something central that Bendis is forgetting here. And for somebody who's been in the industry now for 20 plus years, he's making really amateur mistakes. And if he's just phoning it in, which I'd like to give him more credit than that, to say that he's just phoning it in, although he might be, that's a big, big message on what his motives for writing are. And they reflect in the quality of the storytelling.
Yeah, and I just want to kind of add on to that too, because from the, even from an amateur writer's perspective and stuff like that, I don't like to, I don't want to say that Bendis is, creatively depraved, or anything like that, but sometimes it really does come across like that, because I remember in Man of Steel, Bendis's Man of Steel, when I was reading, the character Rogozar, I just couldn't help but feel that there was something so familiar about this character. And then, at some point reading, one of the issues, it just kind of hit me in terms of, what really is, say, the difference between Rogozar and the character Tyrell from the Superman Earth 1 story. Their goals are exactly the same. Their motivations and stuff are exactly the same. They want the destruction of Krypton, albeit, whether, Rogozar was, paid by, a different planet to do it, or whether it was just because, you know, they were neighbors and they hated each other. Still, it really comes down to, you know, a lot of his stories feeling like, yes, they've been done before and they have been done better, but he still likes to try to push some of these characters as saying these are, you know, original characters that you've never ever seen before. And that just isn't the case. I feel a lot of times, you know, like, you know, again, for example, the storyline Truth, where he has Superman reveal his secret identity, and it really comes across like he's telling something original, you know, almost like he doesn't know that the same storyline, the New 52, happened, also called Truth. It was the exact same title. It was the exact same story. I feel that Rogolzar is the exact same character as Tyrell from Superman Earth 1, and that he just shifted some things around, but essentially told the exact same story, just worse.
Yeah, no, there's a definite like lack of creativity there. And Tevye, or I'm sorry, not Tevye, Tehillim29 says that he thinks that Bendis's passion is in his Jinx world, and it's why he's come to praise it above his DC and Marvel work. I don't necessarily agree, because I also don't think that his latest launch of his Jinx World books were all that good. And I honestly think that my favorite works of his are largely what most other people's favorite works of his are, maybe the original Powers, and the original Jessica Jones series.
This Daredevil was pretty good too.
Yeah. And obviously Ultimate Spider-Man. What I'm trying to think.
I was gonna say I really liked his Ultimate Spider-Man.
Yeah. What was the original Murder? No. The original
Torso. He wrote Torso was pretty good. He wrote Torso.
No. I'm trying to remember the original name. Oh, Alias. Alias was the original name.
Oh, the Jessica Jones. Yeah.
Yeah. Like, he has strong writing from Marvel, and it's what he really got his name, you know, like bolstered from. So I think that he certainly has told incredible stories for Marvel. I don't think there's an argument there.
Oh, but yeah. No, I would say
there's something to be said about his lack of hunger to tell good stories. You know, and I've had this complaint of a lot of really, really big writers, is that they get to a point where they've told some incredible stories, and it feels like they're just, you know, they're either ignoring or avoiding structure or, you know, various elements of story just because they want to just put it out there and phone it in for a check, or maybe, you know, they're not, they don't have that kind of level of paranoia that a creator should always have to keep them in check, right? Because without that, you know, the story's less. And you look at guys like George R.R. Martin, for example, you know, he say what you want about him taking forever to make the book. It's very clear that he doesn't want to put it out until it's excellent. And with the advent of the television series, you know, the Game of Thrones saga has become one of the highest selling works of fiction of all time. All of them have become #1 bestsellers now. And he's still crossing his T's and dotting his I's and making sure that whatever comes out it holds up to, and if not exceeds, his prior work. And there's something to be said about that. And it's evident that it's not something that Bendis is all too concerned with, and a number of other writers. You know, I think that, you know, from a different angle, I haven't liked anything of Scott Snyder's in like 2 years. And I think it's not because he doesn't care. I think he cares, but he certainly lost that kind of paranoia and that hunger that he had when he was telling those early Batman stories. I mean, I don't think there's anything better than his Black Mirror into his early Batman run, and some of his indie works like American Vampire and Witches. He hasn't written anything close to that caliber because he's established, right? He's not afraid to lose his career, because no matter what he writes, people will buy his book because his name is Scott Snyder, and that's become, you know, a sales ticket regardless. And, you know, disclaimer for anybody, you know, that might be watching this out of context, I love Scott Snyder. I do. He's written some of my favorite comics of all time. He was the writer that made me get into reading comics on a weekly and monthly basis. But you know, I can't refrain from the truth and sugarcoat it. You know, a lot of these bigger writers get to a point where they lose the hunger, they lose the paranoia to tell good stories, and a lot of times that's at their detriment.
Yeah, absolutely.
Well,
like I would even say, you know, like you know, one last little mention of Bendis too. Like when he was coming over to DC, you know, you'd heard a lot of different things that, he was given a lot of free reign, in order to get him over there in the first place. And, really comes down to is, the fact that it really almost feels like no one's checking his work or anything like that, because that's part of his thing is like, he's Bendis. His name's going to sell regardless of the quality of the book.
Mm-hmm. And it's and
and that clearly is not the case. I mean, I just did. Earlier today I was bored out of my mind, and so I almost got drunk drinking Corona, looking at DC comic sales for March 2020. I mean, sadly, Bendis is probably selling more comics than most of the DC stuff right now, and it's in the 35,000 range. It's dropped. It's dropped from February. Dropped from February to March. March's average was around 38 and is now down like 35, 30. It's not good. So yeah, Bendis is that's a sinking ship, unfortunately. And with Bendis, it's hard the integrity of the hero's journeys of his characters. It's not there. It's not interesting. It's not the central character flaws, the battles, the adversaries. They're not interesting. And let me defend Scott Snyder for a second. Why? Because I've been hard on Scott Snyder. I said I didn't like Justice League 39 because it never ended. I didn't like the fact that at the end of Justice League 39 we got the 39 issues, and then it wasn't a happy ending. And Scott Snyder told me point blank. He said it's because he responded to me. He was a great guy. He said that the citizens were not inspired enough by the heroes, that it's not the heroes' faults, it's the citizens' fault. And, I'm thinking about that. And I actually have a good feeling I had a good feeling of Scott Snyder's Justice League up until the 39. Mm-hmm. And even though the ending wasn't really happy and it's going to go into death metal, the saving grace of Justice League of his Justice League run is that there are multiple heroic journeys for all the characters. Even Jarl had a hero's journey. The frickin' star Jarl, for God's sakes, in his relationship with Batman from the beginning, he had a heroic arc. Batman had a heroic journey. Superman had a epic moment in Justice League 25. Where him and his son John and his father, all of them, and they defeat, they knock out the World Forger, and there was a lot of epic moments where there were some character arcs where they all had the realizations. Even John Jones and his struggles with his past, and Lex Luthor with his struggle with his past and his connection to John Jones, and like all of it. I could see the work that Scott Snyder put into the individual story arcs. That even though granted, it could have come together better. But the reason why I still enjoyed the journey was because I found individual journeys interesting, so that now I am looking forward to death metal, just to see how it ends. And I think it's just, I say that as an example that even in a storyline that doesn't end the way I like it, if I've enjoyed the journey, I can be very forgiving or more forgiving of a bad ending.
I mean, there's a certain perspective, right? Because, sure. I mean, I'm not going to tell you to not enjoy what you enjoy. But looking at it as somebody who studies these stories to learn how to tell them properly, the stories aren't being told properly. You have to earn those moments. They have to be generated through a plausible series of events, and they're just not there. They happen and they happen at really awkward paces. I mean, there are so many different strings that aren't evaluated. And ultimately is where his run fails for me, with a number of other elements that I think are just poor execution of writing techniques. I know most people are not like me, and they don't look at a comic book and say, hey, this is really garbage dialogue, but I do. And it is an element of good writing across any genre of narrative storytelling. And if you want to look at it from a story perspective, we're rushed through all of these chain of events, to get to a point that sure might feel like a good resolution, but have we earned it? Have we earned the resolution? Just because we like point B doesn't mean that the journey from A to B has earned it. And there's something to be said about that. It just doesn't add up, which is ultimately, one of the biggest reasons why I think Scott Snyder's run on Justice League was disappointing, to say the least. And I know, we brought up the Sixth Dimension arc, and I'll give him that. That was a great arc. I really enjoyed that arc from top to bottom. Art, writing, solid, strong. But out of 7 or 8 arcs, man, like if I only enjoyed one of them, that's not good batting numbers.
Yeah, I know for me personally, I share a lot of the same sentiments that Boom does about the Justice League run. I know you and I, Boom, we were on a stream while back. I think it was right around the Sixth Dimension story arc where we had voted best improved story, and it's like I'm not sure if that was, just due to Scott Snyder starting to really listen to some of the criticisms, or if that was also because James Tynion IV was on those books as well as sort of an assistant helping him. And then, then he jumped off, and I guess for me, they kind of started to get a little convoluted again. But I know for me personally, when it comes to especially the 39th issue, I absolutely hated it. Not just more so because of the as Boom puts it, a sad ending or a dour ending. I would say it was because of the lack of ending, and the fact that I had stuck on there for 39 issues and I was not rewarded for my time nor my money. And instead I was treated with an ad saying, now you just got to buy 6 more books.
Oh, it's going to be more than 6 because they're going to throw you 20 different tie-ins.
Oh yeah, that's probably true. Well, personally, I mean, with me and tie-ins, I always say I think when it comes to tie-ins, the Dark Knight's Metal was the only time I ever bought all of the tie-ins, just because I kind of feel like I needed to a degree.
And they were better than the main book. Yeah,
I'm not gonna lie, I love those one shots with the Dark Knights, especially. Of course, I still gotta give it up to what's his name, the Flash one, the Red Death. Love the Red Death. That was such a good book, but but still, it's just like, most of the time, yeah, I really have no need to ever buy tie-ins and stuff like that. And like I said, when I got to the end of Justice League and I was treated with just an ad to another book, I just kind of felt like, there was a little bit of a reader betrayal there, because again, there was no satisfaction to the hero's journey. And again, what Boom was saying too, and I do agree, I think some of the stuff leading up to it were great. I liked a lot of the character moments. I loved the Shane character. It's like he had to really deal with the fact that he technically doesn't exist, but he does now because he was brought into the real world. Even though he was a creation of the World Forger when he was, trying to get the Justice League to side with him during the Sixth Dimension story arc. And yeah, I mean, I think that's where that last issue is definitely where I felt really burned out. And now I'm even struggling with the fact if I even want to finish it.
And here's the thing is that you can do these big long form stories in comic books, but if you're going to do it, there need to be micro resolutions between each of the arcs. And we didn't really get it at any of the arcs. You know what I mean? His arcs, they really only served to set up the next arc, and it continued and compounded. And we didn't need complete resolution, but we needed certain plot points to be tied up, because all we can expect is for Scott Snyder to do what he's been doing these last couple of years and set up so many different plot points that literally makes it impossible for him to wrap up by the end. Clearly, it's what happened with Metal. There was no resolution. It just moved into Justice League. There was no resolution in any regard. And
there wasn't. Sorry, Dark Knight, were you done?
Not necessarily, but
no, I apologize. Go ahead, finish.
I was just saying that there's no, you can't resolve the entirety, of the story if you want to keep telling it. But there certainly need to be checkpoints of sorts. And throughout all of his throughout Metal and then going into Justice League, yes, there were individual arcs, but were they really fulfilled in any way? All they continue to do is set up the next one. And I can only expect the same thing in Death Metal, where he's going to save everything, all of the decompression and the climax for the last issue, and it's not going to resolve well. He's kind of, unfortunately, lost my trust as a creator to be able to tie up and end his stories, right? Because you look at some of the greatest, for example, long-running television shows of all time, and people will completely disregard them now if the ending isn't tight.
Yeah.
And unfortunately, I think largely comic book fans don't look at it the same way.
Yeah, and I know when it comes to Scott Snyder, and I think tying up, a lot of stories and stuff, before starting new ones was one of the things that made his Batman run so good, is because, he told a story, finished it, moved on to the next, told that, moved on to the next, moved on to the next, until we got to the end, maybe leaving, small little hints here and there for the finale in itself. And that's, that is definitely an element that I wish Justice League run would have had, was a few little breathing moments before, you just thrust, back into, the story again. And I really do hope that that Death Metal does end up tying everything up well. But I can definitely understand, your worries with that as well, because we're essentially tying up a story that started, like when Death Metal started, was 2017.
The original Metal,
yeah.
16. I know we were definitely getting teases in 2016, maybe even 2016.
So I mean, that's a to get a resolution to a story that started a while back is, that's definitely going to be tough to, I think, satisfy the audience that stuck around for the entirety of that run.
And
it's ironic there that we're dealing with Death Metal, that we're dealing with a huge amount of DC mythology. Scott Snyder dealt right with all of DC's mythology right from its beginning. And so if ever there was a time for an epic, perfect moment for a hero's journey, when you're dealing with, he literally, in many ways, built on and rewrote huge aspects of DC mythology. And he did do it he did it somewhat piecemeal, but there was connective tissue there between the arcs. It was there. And for someone like myself who was there from the beginning and read them all, I could see where it was a little disjointed, but I did see more of the connective tissue than not. And I think that when you're with all those characters for 38 issues, you're living those characters. And so when you get to the 39th issue, and I feel that, I just felt the loss. So I got to give him some credit that when an ending disappoints me, I have to give him credit. Like 38 issues I liked. It was the 39th issue that really broke my heart. Mm-hmm. But I think he, by his own admission, that was his intention. I mean, he intended, because the heroes lost, he intended Doom to win. That was his intention. My understanding is from the beginning. Sure. That it was, and so the story's not over yet. And I think, and I suppose if we're like, frankly, I think the original intention was Justice League was going to go beyond. The story was supposed to finish in Justice League, but Snyder said that if he could get Greg Capullo to do the art, he wanted to have a separate series to end it. So in fairness to him, I think it just worked out that way because of editorially, they wanted to make more money. They could make more money making it a separate series as opposed to finishing it in the pages of Justice League.
Well, it would have taken
it
would have taken the same amount of time regardless, though, because if that were the case, then it's almost like saying, the story would have wrapped up sooner and it would have been more concise. But regardless, he could have told a tighter story in those 39 issues and properly set up his next thing with Greg Capullo. And it's and you bring up the connective tissue. Sure, I'll give you that. There's certainly a connective tissue there, but he's trying to do the impossible. He's trying to be a sprinter for a long distance run, and you just can't do it. It's physically impossible. If you want to be a good sprinter, you don't do long distance. That's just not what happens. It's the same in the writing. The writing, he's trying to write a sprint in a 5K marathon, and it's impossible. You can't do it. And he kind of openly acknowledges it and just like, no, I'm going to try to do it anyways. So it almost feels like he's setting himself up to fail.
Yeah, and I can definitely, and I'll again, like you too, Boom. I stuck around from the beginning, and I've been on that journey the entire time, and I see the connective tissue. I understand it and stuff like that, but I think there still needs to be, certain breaks in the narrative just to allow a little bit more breathing room, especially for, because it's, seemingly one continuous narrative. I generally equate a story with, no breaks to allow any kind of compression to just holding someone's head underwater. And it's just like when you finally get to a break, pull them up, take a breath, put them back down, which is it. His story has kind of felt, his Justice League kind of felt like that a little bit to me, where it just didn't really, I was like enjoying it, but there was no definitive satisfaction that I got at the end.
Mm-hmm. And it's interesting. There's something to be said, because no matter how good death metal is, ultimately, I think the long form storytelling is still a failure. It's still bad writing, no matter how good this ending is, because we shouldn't have taken 30 plus issues of metal with all the tie-ins and whatnot, plus 39 issues of Justice League, plus annuals and specials, plus death metal, and how many ever issues. You know what I mean? I think
and you can't forget the Justice League No Justice that led into Justice League in the first place.
Yeah, I mean, it's like, I mean, this is an arbitrary number, but it's like, what, 70 something, 80 issues, and you're finally going to wrap it up with no. You could do it, sure, if there were those micro resolutions in plot lines, and then you set up the next thing. But again, he's trying to sprint a marathon, and it doesn't work. So sure, he might finish the race, but he's gonna finish it in last place because he's trying to do the impossible. So sure, could it be a strong finish? Yeah, absolutely. Metal could be something that I regret not picking up, because metal in and of itself could be very strong. But ultimately, as a whole, you look at the big picture, there are so many issues with the long form storytelling that I couldn't call it a success, no matter how good the ending is. And Skip and Tosh brings up Hickman and how he does a lot of setup and world building, but he has the ability to wrap up everything by the time it's done. And it doesn't feel rushed. It's not like, he spends the entire arc to climax and decompress. Snyder spends the last issue to climax and decompress. And by decompress, the post climax in his big arcs, right? Metal and then Justice League have been setups for something else. So we haven't truly gotten decompression to any extent.
Yeah, I read Hickman's East of West, and it was 9 volumes long, and it's really good, and it ends. It has an ending. It was a decent ending. I can't say it blew me away, but I was satisfied. It all the character arcs more or less resolved. It left some questions open, but I was asking the right kinds of questions at the end of it, and it could still continue. So it's really good. I really like Secret Wars, Hickman. I loved how, it was a nice payoff with Fantastic Four, Reed Richards, the family going off into the multiverse, and that's when at the end of Secret Wars is when the Fantastic Four left the Marvel Universe. It was a beautiful send off for Reed Richards and the family. It was beautifully written. It was well done. The use of Doctor Doom, Reed Richards and Doctor Doom as the very much a hero's journey played out. You talk about two characters with shadows. They both had their own shadows, and they were the shadows of each other and other characters. That's Reed Richards and Doctor Doom. How that played out in Secret Wars was fantastic, beautifully done, beautiful example of a hero's journey. No question. I can't disagree with it. I very desperately am trying to find some lipstick to put on the pig of a Justice League story that I really want. I want the landing to really hit for death metal.
Oh yeah, we definitely all do. Like, especially just, like I said, just sticking on it for all that time. I want nothing more than, the ship to land as smoothly as possible. And, not just that, but maybe even take me on the best ride of my life in terms of this overall story. But I definitely have some reservations about that. And, it's going to be interesting to see how he does it. And, I'm kind of, also interested in what kind of, in terms of the hero's journey, how he's going to even continue that into death metal, because he's done so much already. Shane definitely got a conclusion to his story and hero's journey. So did Jaro, which I think, both those stories were done. Absolutely. I love those stories. I love the way they wrapped up those two characters. But now I'm just kind of wondering, and this is my big reservation, is in terms of the hero's journey and what he's done with some of the characters and whatnot, what's left. That's the big thing too, is, when you tell such a big story, you can only, within the span of one giant centralized story, you can only spin that wheel so many times. And then of course now I have to wonder, because when we started Robert Venditti's story, where was Hawkgirl? Where was Martian Manhunter? These characters were not present in that book. And, is that something that's going to be brought up within the death metal book itself? So it's going to be interesting just to see how it ends, if nothing else, whether the book is good or bad. But yeah, that's kind of my thoughts on that.
Yeah. I mean, just tying it into the conversation of the hero's journey. I mean, really, it feels like story of the week with his run so far, and I don't feel like these characters have really learned much. The only real example that is shown is the Sixth Dimension arc. There's truly character growth for Batman. There's character growth for Superman, but in the rest of the arcs, can we really look at many of these characters and think, wow, they've really changed and been impacted, besides like the various circumstances around them? No, not really. And
I could argue for a few of them, like Hawkgirl, for example, and stuff like that. When it comes to Lex Luthor, for sure.
But was it earned? Like Lex Luthor, I mean, I talked about this, I think, on a stream. I don't remember if it was our Comics and Coffee stream or if it was on one with Boom, but I don't think they earned Lex being a bad guy. Like Tevia brings up how Bendis came in and made Doctor Doom a villain again. It kind of feels the same thing with what Scott Snyder did with Lex. Lex was still in the middle of his hero arc when they suddenly made him murder Vandal Savage with a doorknob. I mean, did we really earn that transition? No, because he was still transitioning into a hero. It wasn't like a trial that was thrown in his face and maybe he made a mistake and then set himself back up on the path. It was literally, he NASCAR'd that shit and took another left turn. That's what it felt like. So I don't think Lex had an arc. I'll give you a Hawkgirl. Sure. Okay. Out of your massive cast, 3 characters have an arc that those lessons, have they really impacted the story moving forward? Have they impacted how those characters are going to respond to the stimuli in the story? Have we seen that yet? I'm not so sure. And Tevia asks, do we think death metal will fix the DC Universe timeline and erase 5G? I mean, 5G hasn't happened, so I don't think it's.
As far as I know, I think it's still going to happen. They're just going to have death metal, pretty much decide what it's going to end up being, rather than what the original plan was. And I think I had heard, I don't know how true it is, that they're even toning it down to just a couple of one shots rather than actually replacing the stories altogether. Like instead of it's just one issue of Captain Boomerang, Son of the Flash, rather than giving him his own series and stuff like that.
I think you're right on that, because I think from what I've read, they're going to be toning down some of the one shots. They've changed some of the content, and death metal is going to be, however it ends, is going to be the new status quo for the DC universe moving forward. And I think we're not going to get Luke Fox's Batman. We're not going to get a new Flash, Captain Boomerang's son. We're not going to get that nonsense. And if we do, it's going to be in an alternate universe or some sideline,
some
Elseworld story.
Shit.
Yeah,
it's going to be
Future's End.
Some Future's End shit. That's
sorry.
No, I was saying it's going to be like something like Future's End, where they profess all of these things that are going to happen, and then it's like, oh, it's totally inconsequential. Nothing matters.
Yeah, it just doesn't happen.
Yeah, I mean, on that, I agree with you guys 100%. Metal will redefine what 5G is going to be. Mm-hmm. I guarantee you 5G is not the same thing that Dan DiDio set out to establish. 5G is going to be whatever Scott Snyder's death metal resolves into. So, and there's something interesting I did want to bring up in the chat. You know, Tevya and Skip and Tosh had brought up how, you know, the issue of a lot of these big stories are the editorial mandates to drag things out, stringing them along to sell more and more comics. And I think that's certainly the issue with a lot of stories, but with Scott Snyder's Justice League and Metal and all of those things, that's not the inherent problem here. So if we want to talk about it being strung out, Scott Snyder has been given more time to write a tight story, to develop things, to wrap things up, and we haven't gotten that.
Right.
We haven't had the moment for the sprinter, you know, to pass the baton to the next person so they can run. It's the same sprinter going, and that's why it doesn't work. So, you know, I agree that certainly editorial mandates can have big issues with these large stories, but in Scott Snyder's case, it's on Scott Snyder. I'm not putting the blame elsewhere, because he has been given ample time to make sure his stories are tight. He's been given everything he needs, all of the tools to tell good stories and to be able to perpetuate them in a way that we can continue onto bigger and broader narratives, and they haven't been tight enough. So I don't know. That's my thoughts. But yeah, I mean, centrally, you know, and as we close, we're approaching 2 hours here, so we'll kind of wrap it all back into the conversation of the hero's journey, because we went on a bit of a tangent, as we tend to do, which are always fun. But so I'm wondering for you guys, and we'll I guess use it in the context of this Justice League run, Metal and Death Metal. Do you feel like Snyder has properly utilized the hero's journey in the storytelling? And I'm wondering, you know, what your reasoning is for your answer behind it. What are you guys thinking?
I mean, for me, I think, again, in certain instances, yes, when it comes to certain characters, but in the broad spectrum of the story that he's telling, no, because we have not really seen the end of that story.
You went in and out there with your question. Are you asking, do I think Snyder was successful in using the hero's journey? Is that your question?
Yes. Yeah. And if so, or if not, why?
Right. Well, I'll just reiterate what I said before. I'm not happy with Justice League 39, but it's not over yet. And a hero's journey is never really over, even arguably when it's over. But I do hope that we're going to get a happy ending. Not that I necessarily need one, but I want some payoff from all the character moments. I do believe we've had a lot of character moments in the 39 issues of Justice League. We've had a lot of interesting character arcs, and I do think we had more than one hero's journey, and it was interesting. And that, leaving aside the holes in the plot, I think some of the character movements I found interesting. It was the characterizations that kept me glued to Scott Snyder's Justice League in many ways. And so I would say overall, it was the successful character arcs, heroic through the hero's journey, that worked for me. And so I would say, yes, it's generally worked. That's the saving grace for me for Snyder's Justice League is that it actually had a little bit of a hero's journey there that I can grasp onto going into Death Metal.
So I think my answer is going to be obvious. No, I think he's failed. I think primarily, if you want to talk about it in a broad spectrum, Scott Snyder has been in the abyss, the big challenge stage of his story arc from No Justice onward, We've had 40 plus issues of the Abyss, and that's just not how you pace the hero's journey. A majority of his story has been at one intersection broadly, right? He's continually upping the challenge of the Justice League. The Justice League is continually failing so that he can set up this final sort of rebirth for these characters, the resurrection, where they're going to learn and they're going to overcome these trials. We've been in the same spot for 2 years now, and that's ultimately poor pacing in not only the act structure but the hero's journey. And sure, you want to talk about how we've given some individual characters their time to shine now. It's been, we've talked, it's been a cumulative 70 plus issues. All of these characters should have gone through some aspect of a hero's journey, all of them by now, and they haven't. And most importantly, I don't think they have as an ensemble, which as an ensemble title, they should have, right? Because it's not about individual characters where you can give them spotlights, I understand, but it is about how the ensemble is going to grow. Justice League isn't supposed to be Batman and his bitches or Superman and his bitches. It's supposed to be the Justice League. It's supposed to be all of these characters growing or receding in tandem. There needs to be a correlation there, and there's not. Aside from the fact that, again, I think that we've been in the abyss, of the hero's journey for 40 issues now, and that's way too long. We should have been walking out of the abyss, 20 minutes ago, if you ask me. So it's an odd thing. And I think the reason why I'm so critical is because I wanted nothing more than for this to be my favorite thing going on in comics. I walked into the Justice League run in Metal with Scott Snyder literally being my favorite writer in comic books. And it hasn't even finished, but I'm walking out midway through thinking, I don't trust him the same way I did going into it. And I think ultimately that's an issue on the writing, because and perhaps I'm too critical, and perhaps, I am kind of manifesting the image of the most depressing guy in comics, but I certainly don't think that he's perpetuating strong storytelling just because he's giving us various bite-sized pieces of things we want to see, right? Like, you can't just say, here is the best steak you'll ever have without cooking the steak. That's just not how it works. You can't just pull it out of, Starro's jar and say, here you go. It's not how it works.
So you've lost faith. You've lost your faith, but you're also the person that you want to eat the steak before it's done. Story's not over yet.
Bruv, I want a medium rare steak. I don't want a blackened steak.
But hey, just remember too, everybody likes different rarities in their steak.
Sure, but the only right one is medium rare.
Oh, so you say.
But I mean, just looking at structural writing, there's a lot of issues there, that I can't avoid. I can't, even as a fan of his, as a fan of these characters, I can't ignore it. I think ultimately one of the issues there is that the hero's journey, aside from other things, are not being fulfilled. There's a big issue in the pace of the hero's journey, right? The pacing is so important because the time that you're spending on each one of those sort of steps of the hero's journey will define how impactful they are. They shouldn't all be granted the same amount of time in the story, right? For certain, but there needs to be like an allocation of time that we need to spend for with these characters going through certain steps of the journey, and it's unbalanced. Like I said, we've spent 40 issues of them being in the abyss, of the stakes constantly going higher and higher and higher and higher and higher, and these characters aren't learning anything by that. Recessive failure, it feels like Sanctuary, where they make you go through your trauma over and over and over and over and over and over again and think that you're going to come out a better person, because you're not. Conceptually, that's how it feels to me. And ultimately, I make these critiques not because I want to bash him, because I love the guy, and he's told some of my favorite stories of all time, but because I want people to recognize that, no matter how much we love these creators of these characters, there still kind of needs to be a standard for them to be held by, right? Like, they need to earn those moments that make us, smile, laugh, cry. They need to earn that. They can't just put it on the plate and say, here you go. It's not a spontaneously generated thing. And I think that kind of wraps back into the hero's journey really well, because it's a journey, right? You don't jump from one step to another. The most important thing is that line connecting each one of the dots, not necessarily the dots themselves.
Well, the hero's journey ends with the hero returning with the elixir, with the gift that he brings back to the world, and how he interacts with the world and how he shares that with the world. That's part of the story as well. And so the question is going to be, with Justice League, with the heroes of the DC universe coming out into death metal, when they return to the world after they've defeated their adversary, what is the elixir going to look like? What is that gift to readers going to look like? And is it going to be satisfying? Clearly, Dark Knight, from your experience of the journey beforehand, you have little doubt that it's going to be a satisfactory gift. I choose, and so does Joe. I think we hold out against all reason to hope that the gift, the elixir, will be worth the wait.
I will. I mean, you guys obviously have every right to do so, but I will pull the "I told you so" card with Bendis' Superman. I think I'd like to think that I have a pretty good judge of.
Well, I think a lot of us saw that train wreck coming, though. I mean, well, I mean, for me, considering where Bendis was at when he first exited Marvel, I mean, Bendis himself quickly moved from a writer I absolutely enjoyed to I don't want to get his books anymore. During that, his back half time at Marvel, and then when he was coming over to Superman, right away I was just like, that character's all wrong for him. But I just kind of picked up the Man of Steel just to kind of like maybe, just maybe, and yeah, I was let down hard on that one.
Yeah, so I throw that in the ring every time. It's my saving grace, man. So I might come off as the hater of comic books, but it's like, man, I can see a stinker coming from a mile away. I'm telling you. But with all that being said, it does really wrap in well to the kind of discussion of the hero's journey, and truly how difficult it is to execute it properly, because there are so many different ways you can execute it. And even, the best writers with the biggest names can fail at doing that, right? Like we've talked about it extensively. And we've talked about kind of some of the things that kind of define what is essential to a hero's journey. And I think it's been a really interesting conversation, because it's not one that folks necessarily talk about with comic books specifically because of its periodical nature. So I'm thankful, for you guys to come and sit down and shoot the breeze for a couple of hours and talk about something like that, because I think it's a conversation that kind of needs to be had. So it was a good time, man. So thank you guys both so much for sitting down and talking the hero's journey with me. And starting with Joey, man, do you guys have any upcoming videos or projects you want to plug to let the viewers know what you're up to?
Oh yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think you said it towards the beginning too. I've been working on sort of a little retrospective look at the Mark Waid Flash book 1, and I have my final video for that coming out this week. And I'm also working on a bit of a videos where I'm also looking into the All-Star Batman and Robin book. Just for the fun of it, and I think I got some really good plans for that one coming out that I think you all enjoy, which will be in the coming weeks and stuff. So those are definitely my two biggest projects that I'm going to be working on over on my channel. So definitely, give it a look. Head on over, as soon as you can to look at my other Mark Waid Flash videos. There's 5 up in total, so it's going to be a total of 6 when I'm done with it. And that's been really fun. And yeah, thanks for having me on, man. I've really appreciate the invite. I had a lot of fun as always talking to you guys.
Yeah, man, absolutely. And Boom, do you have anything coming up?
Well, I'm still working on my review for God Country. I know I've been saying that for a while, and I've actually done a lot of wrapping of bagging and boarding comic books and reading. I've spending a lot of time with the family and enjoying it, frankly. And I could do more videos, but honestly, I this pandemic's had the opposite effect. I thought I was going to be doing all kinds of videos, but it was the exact opposite. And I can't say it. And it's a good thing. I realized how much I've spent more time with family than I ever have. And there's been, not to get all, not to get all weepy eyed about it, but it was, I've really spent a lot of time with family and I've really enjoyed it. And I've read so many back issues. I've went into storage. I took comic books out. I've wrapped some. I got a lot of key issues. I'm more in touch with my collection than any ever before. I'm probably going to be doing more. Just drinking and showing back issues. Having some of those types of videos where I just show some of my comic books because I'm bored and I'm, So I don't know. Beyond that, I'll probably do a God Country review and. I'm sure Dark Knight and I will figure out doing something, and Joe will probably, have you back on, or I'll have you guys on my channel at some point, and we'll figure something out.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, absolutely, man.
You guys will always see Boom on the channel. We collaborate almost once a week when I'm consistent. So you can always find.
Yeah, there actually came a point where you guys were collabing so much in these last few weeks. I was like, do these guys even sleep? Like, what's good?
Listen, it's a good, honestly, man, for me, doing these live streams are a good recharge at the end of the week. They kind of get me away from, because I live alone, so I don't really have family to bounce off of. So when I get to sit and chat comics with you guys, it helps to kind of recharge the batteries. So I'm always very thankful for it. But yeah, of course, make sure you guys, make sure to like this video if you enjoyed it. That helps us out a lot. Small YouTubers need all of the support we can possibly get. And if you enjoy this video, please share it with a friend. It's one of the most underrated ways of helping out smaller videos and smaller channels. For me, this coming week is my finals week, so I'll probably do another collaborative stream on the weekend once my finals are over, and then I'll start getting into the habit of making more comic book reviews and analyses. I've been talking about it forever, but I will do the first 4 issues of Donny Cates' Thor, as issue 5 is going to be coming out in the coming weeks, so it'll get you guys set up if you haven't been able to check that out already. So stick around. We will be coming back big and bad. And I want to thank everybody, of course, who is watching us live. You guys are the spirit of shows like these. You keep the conversation going. So big thanks to Tehillim29, Skip and Tosh, Tevya Smolka, Sumoki Dude. Am I missing anybody? I think that was the main body, but I want to thank you guys so much for participating. Thank you for watching us live. And of course, thank you to my 2 friends here for collaborating with me. So again, appreciate you guys a bunch. Thank you for watching. And this has been another great episode of Let's Talk Comics. We'll see you on the next episode with another one of my excellent